While excavating the Library of Ashurbanipal in 1849, English archaeologist Austin Layard discovered a text on 7 clay tablets, which would come to be known as the Enuma Elish. The story is that of the Babylonian creation epic, in which the storm god Marduk battles gods of chaos, subduing them to bring about order and begin the task of creating the world. The great ocean is conquered, a mighty dragon is slain, the dome of the firmament is erected, and eventually, animals and humans are brought into existence. So similar is the story to the later account of Genesis 1 that scholars have long debated the exact nature of the relationship between these two stories. Was the 7-day creation account a Hebrew adaptation of the Babylonian epic, or did both stories derive from an earlier common ancestor? Like so many other questions concerning biblical studies, the answer is complicated. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons in Genesis. The book of Genesis can be divided into 2 sections. The first chapters offer stories concerning the creation of the world, a pair of epics that weren't meant to be read together. Following this is a series of folkloric stories which outline the actions of characters meant to serve as the progenitors of the people of Israel and their neighbors, those being Adam, Noah, Shem, Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, and Joseph. Or the book can be divided into the primeval history, the first 11 chapters, and then the patriarchal age, chapters 12 to 50. This division focuses on genres presented in the book. The first section is deeply mythological, with gods getting their hands dirty as they directly move along the events of the world, while the later chapters are far less mythological, meaning the deities work behind the scenes, moving people about the world like chess pieces. However we choose to divide the book, we must understand that this collection of stories was written by different people at different times, and then stitched together at a later date, likely in a series of stages as more material was added to the collection. We must also understand that this book isn't nearly as old as some might want you to believe. There's a significant amount of Babylonian influence to be found throughout the book, an influence which was imparted on the Jewish people during their time in captivity in Babylon, beginning in 586 BCE, some 8 centuries after Moses ostensibly lived and wrote the book. There's also some amount of Zoroastrian influence, which came to them during their time under Persian control, which began with Cyrus's conquest of Babylon around 540 BCE, and ended with the conquest of Alexander the Great a couple centuries later. This is the period in which Genesis originated, after the time Jerusalem fell to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, but before the time of Alexander the Great, though there's still a chance, and some reason to believe, that it didn't reach its current form until well into the Greek period. But that's a topic for another episode. Genesis opens with a creation story that is often referred to as the 6-day creation. As we'll soon see, this is wrong on 2 points. First, the book contains not 1, but 2 entirely separate and contradictory creation myths, and the one found in the opening chapter is actually the later of the 2. Second, creation doesn't end with the events of the 6th day, but with the final creation on the 7th. But we'll unpack those details along with many others in just a bit. To understand Genesis 1, which actually extends into the first few verses of Genesis 2, we must understand creation stories in the ancient Near East. If one were to examine the stories of Canaan, Mesopotamia, and other cultures who had some amount of contact and influence over the information in the Bible, you'd notice several similarities and dissimilarities. They all contain stories which detail how the world as they understood it came to be. They all included explanations for the sun, moon, and stars, along with the flow of rivers and destructive power of the sea. And they all had an origin story for humanity. But when you compare these stories to the first chapter of Genesis, you'll find some rather striking differences. Chief among them is that the text seems to imply that there is only one God responsible for creation, not an entire pantheon. The aforementioned sun, moon, and stars are thus demoted from the status of divine beings to that of mere creations of a singular deity. This demotion extends to the great sea monsters and dragons, which once featured so prominently in creation myths, but now seem almost an afterthought, not a rival for power. Another key difference is the democratization of the divine image, and this is one we'll need to explain a bit further. In the ancient world, many cultures believed their king to be their link to the gods in the heavens, and in some cases their king was believed to be divine, an earthly incarnation of a patron deity who became manifest in an individual in order to guide the city or nation into prosperity. But the first creation account of Genesis seeks to do the opposite, to establish the populace as being connected to their God, created in his image, rather than being mere humans who must look to a king who was created in the image of their God. This is because the story we have in Genesis 1 was composed during a period in which the Hebrew authors had no king. Their divine kings were no more. The royal dynasty had ended violently in disaster as an invading army had conquered their lands, razed their cities, demolished their temples, and then carted off their nobility to enslavement in a foreign land. In order to connect with their God, they could no longer focus on their divine king, nor could they rely on idols, which served as a focal point in ancient worship, as those too had been carried away and then melted down. Yes, prior to the Babylonian exile in 587 BCE, the temples in Judah had idols, which were used in worship. It may be an uncomfortable detail for some to accept, but when studying the Bible, there will be many such facts that fly in the face of what some were taught from the pulpit. This is why the post-exilic writings are so concerned with the abolishment of these idols. They're rewriting history and the rules for worship in order to adapt to their new situation, not to accurately represent the facts. So the author of Genesis 1 lived in a time in which their idols were no more and their divine kingship had been abolished. Their God was now invisible and they had no king through which to connect to him. So the image of their God was no longer in an idol, but in the very worshippers themselves. With a single idea, that of the Jews being the image of their God, both problems had been resolved, as well as a third. In the exilic and post-exilic periods, the people had been scattered from Egypt to Judah to Babylon and beyond. They were fragmented. Worse yet, their identifying traits had been erased, and they faced assimilation within the foreign cultures where they now existed. By linking their God with the identity of the fragmented Jewish communities, they forged a new identity in the aftermath of crippling defeat. This not only aided them in creating a new cultural identity during their time in exile, but served as a powerful religious polemic against those who had not been exiled when the returning Jews entered the land to conquer it from their long-lost relatives. For a better understanding of this idea, I'd recommend the book Why the Bible Began by Jacob L. Wright. Now that we understand a bit about the context, let's talk about the dating of the story. Genesis 1 comes to us from the priestly source. That is a source which added narrative and legal material to the early books of the Bible sometime around the late 6th to mid-4th centuries BCE. You see, the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, weren't written as 5 individual books. They began as a collection of stories that were loosely cobbled together and later expanded upon. As new factions rose in prominence, they added material and rearranged the stories to suit their interest and theological beliefs. Scholars divide the material that comprises the Torah into 2 main groups, P and non-P, meaning the priestly material written by the Zadokite priests who entered the land from Babylon after the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persians, and the non-P material, which is all the parts of the Torah which were not added by those Zadokite priests. This non-P material is then subdivided into 3 sources, J, E, and D. J for Yahwist, E for Elohist, and D for Deuteronomist. The first 2 refer to the different names used for God in the Torah, And the last is for the revisionists who rewrote much of their history in the Torah, along with the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy, and inspired the creation of the later books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Though it should be noted that modern scholarship still debates how much we can actually subdivide the non-P material, and how that material was composed and modified over the generations before it reached its current form. And for more information on this complex topic, I'd recommend reading Dr. Joel S. Baden's book, The Composition of the Pentateuch. During the Exilic and Persian periods, this adaptation of older creation myths was carefully arranged and written in order to preface the emerging work that would become known as the Book of Genesis, which already had a creation story at its beginning, that of the Eden story, which we will cover in the next episode. This story, involving the creation of the world over a succession of days, was appended to the beginning of the book to enforce the idea that all that followed was subordinate to a singular Jewish creator god. Great chaos monsters that were originally pre-existent, and often more powerful than the gods of the Hebrew pantheon, were now mere animals. The other gods had their names removed, and some, like Shamash and Yarek, the gods of the sun and moon, respectively, lost their divinity altogether and were now simply lights placed in the heavens for the benefit of humanity. However, we shouldn't think that the people who wrote this text were strict monotheists at this point in their history. The story means to establish their God as the chief god of creation, but not necessarily as the sole god, as we'll soon see. In neither creation story is the existence of other gods denied. Rather, they step back from the spotlight so that El Elyon, or Yahweh, might take center stage. Their journey towards monotheism is ongoing at this point, and not yet complete. And with those details out of the way, let's finally get started. Many ancient creation myths include a theogony, which is a story of how the pantheon came to be, or where their gods came from. Genesis conspicuously lacks such a story. In it, their God is simply there, and the story of how he came to be isn't included. This theological statement and its ramifications is one way in which the ancient Israelites break from their neighbors and their own past tradition. They once had such stories, but during the creation of the biblical text, they worked hard to remove any mention of them. But we'll catch glimpses of these older traditions as we progress in our studies. The story begins with El, the name for an ancient Canaanite god, as he is creating the world in which the author lives. It reads, "When El began to create the earth, and the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the Tehom, and a wind or spirit from El swept over the water, El said, 'Let there be light.'" Notice here that it doesn't say "in the beginning," a phrase that some translators prefer for theological reasons, as they wish to present this as a story which takes place at the beginning of time. Also, the world already exists, and it's covered in a vast dark ocean, so there is no creation ex nihilo, or a concept of creation from nothing. El is here to bring order out of chaos, arrange the matter of the primordial world in such a manner as to resemble the world of the present. A brief aside on the name of God in this chapter. The word used is Elohim, which has multiple meanings depending on context. It can be used as a generic term for a god, literally meaning God, lowercase g. It can also refer to a specific god, like a proper name, God with a capital G, which we find here in Genesis 1. When this occurs, it's almost certainly a reference to the Great High God, which is sometimes rendered God Most High, or El Elyon, the highest god in the Canaanite pantheon. The third and final meaning is the plural form, or gods. This too occurs in the Hebrew Bible, such as here in Genesis 1:27 when it reads, "So El created humankind in their image. In the image of the gods he created them. Male and female created he them." Also, this god, El, is the father of the Canaanite pantheon, sort of like Zeus was for the Greeks. He had a wife named Asherah, who is also in the Bible, and together they had 70 sons. The Jewish authors kept these beliefs for a while, but eventually abandoned them as they cleaned up their pantheon and reduced it to just a singular deity. But El wasn't originally Canaanite. He seems to be a composite god who came from Mesopotamia, with traits from Amurru, Anu, and Enki. There he was sometimes called El-Knersa, a name which means God, creator of earth, and one which the much later Hebrew writers referenced in Genesis 14:19 when they quote the pagan god's name verbatim. Also, we have the water referenced to as the Tehom, a Hebrew word for the deep ocean or the abyss, which is a Hebrew cognate of Tiamat, the Babylonian chaos monster often depicted as a great dragon. This is a remnant of something called creation by combat, a style of creation myth in which a god begins creation by defeating a rival god, often a monster, a god of death, or a water dragon that represents the sea. What the Hebrew author has done here is to reimagine the Hebrew creation by combat myth in a manner that removes many of the mythological elements. Gone is the great dragon which was slain at the beginning of creation, and gone, too, is the idea that their god must struggle to accomplish great feats. In their place, their god rules over disorganized matter and creates and arranges simply by commanding nature to obey his voice. You see, early in human history, goddesses were more prominent than they were in the late Bronze Age. They were associated with the earth and the seas, and also the moon. But as civilization spread and people had more time to study the skies in relation to fixed objects like buildings and city walls, and they had the ability to keep records of the movements of celestial objects, they noticed recurring patterns in their movements. The rising and setting of the sun along the horizon moved north and south with the changing of the seasons, and different constellations appeared in the sky at different times. And unlike the unpredictable winds, these celestial bodies all moved along orderly paths. This gave rise to the idea of a sky god that organized creation and brought order to chaos, the divine lawgiver. Eventually, these stories of a father and mother god giving birth to the universe, or working together to create the world like a massive dwelling place, were removed with a new sort of creation myth taking their place. The mother goddess was associated with chaos and destruction in direct opposition to a father god of the sky, who turned her dangerous primordial world into something orderly, predictable, and safe. No longer were they partners in creation, but opponents. Thus was born the creation by combat myth, in which the sky god slaughtered the mother goddess. Her body was dismembered and used as building material for the orderly world. The most popular myth was the Enuma Elish, where the mother goddess is depicted as a great dragon, but it isn't unique. These myths span the Mediterranean world and far beyond, from Greece to India. It's a demotion of the mother goddess from ancient religion, first to the status of a monster and enemy, and eventually to a mere element of nature, the tumultuous sea. This is what lies behind the Tehom in Genesis 1, and this pattern of demoting a once prominent goddess will be seen again in the next episode when we cover the Garden of Eden. We see this arrangement of chaos into order in verse 4, as this God separates the light from darkness, calling one of them day and the other night. So the light which was created wasn't as bright as the day, but a homogeneous dimness like dusk. It was then gathered and concentrated to become day, while the remaining period would become night. This gives us a day-night cycle, which is then called the first day, as verse 5 tells us that time proceeded into evening and then morning, completing the first day. Note that their day begins at evening, which comes before morning, as in Jewish tradition. This began alongside their switch to a lunar calendar in the Second Temple period. Prior to the destruction of the First Temple, they seemed to use a solar calendar, and their day began with the rising of the sun. El further separates matter to begin order in verse 6, when the waters of the world are divided in half, allowing dry land to emerge. The waters are separated by an enormous dome, which is called the firmament. This lifts half the waters of the Tehom, the primordial ocean, into the heavens and seals them off from the rest of the world. This is our first reference to their cosmology, which we'll see referenced again and again throughout our studies. They believed the world was a flat disk, perhaps a couple thousand miles across, which stretched from modern-day Libya to the middle of Iran, with Jerusalem at its geographic center. At the edges of the disk, the firmament connected to the ground, and in this dome were gates that could be opened and closed, allowing the winds and the rain to pass through, as well as the sun, moon, and stars, which would enter through gates in the east and exit through gates in the west before dipping below the horizon, circling around to the north until they returned to their starting points on the eastern horizon the following day. These gates in the firmament will be mentioned again in the flood story as they're opened, and these waters are then released to cover the earth and return it to its primordial state in the coming chapters, which we will cover in episode 6. Now let's examine the composition of the creation story. This chapter was carefully outlined to follow a pattern of pairs of 3-day cycles, meaning days 1, 2, and 3 are meant to match days 4, 5, and 6. Let's break this down. On day 1, light is first created by brightening the sky, and then it's divided into 2 parts, day and night. Fast forward to day 4 in verse 16. El creates 2 great lamps, which are positioned in the sky, and they rule over the day and the night. Also in day 1, an aspect of creation is separated, while in day 4, it is not separated. This pattern will likewise continue as separation occurs in the first 3 days, but does not occur in days 4 through 6. Another part of the pattern is the naming of the elements of creation, which also occur in the first 3 days, but not the subsequent 3. In day 2, the firmament is created inside the water to divide it into 2 parts, and in day 5, creatures are created, also in the water. We will encounter something odd which has troubled some theologians in verse 21, as El creates the creatures of the sea, and among them are the birds. How should we explain this troublesome passage? If you attempt to understand this as narrative history, you're going to have a difficult time. But if you remember that this is a formulaic poem, and day 5 is meant to mirror day 2, then the answer becomes clear. The firmament was erected within the waters and served as a ceiling for the sky. So to match that, creatures of both water and sky are thus created on the 5th day. But before we move off from the water section of creation, we must look at verse 21. It reads, "So El created the great sea monsters and every living thing that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm." Before creating the fish and shrimp and everything else in the oceans, El creates great sea monsters. This is the reduction of the pre-existent dragons of their creation myth to the status of created animals, which are subordinate to God. We'll see both versions of this idea later when we cover the book of Job, as Leviathan, the great dragon, is said to be a mere creation of God, but also the battle at the beginning of time in which Yahweh fights the dragon in order to kickstart the creation of the world. One last thing in this section. On every day of creation, the section ends with El stating that he looked at that element of the world and declared it to be a good thing, with one exception. In verse 9, when the waters that represent the slain chaos dragon and the embodiment of evil are divided in half, El does not declare that the waters are good. All of creation is deserving of that praise, with the exception of El's great enemy, the slain dragon of chaos and death. On day 3, dry land is created, and it gives rise to the plants. Likewise, day 6 sees creation occur on land, and the animals and humans are created. As with the water, the earth is given the task of creating the creatures that come from it, as El delegates creation to the elements of nature that he has formed. Things get interesting in verse 26. The 6 days of creation have been building toward a climax, which comes to us in two parts. First, there's the final creation on the 6th day, the creation of humanity. Unlike chapter 2, which has a singular man created first and then a singular woman created much later, this creation story has men and women created simultaneously, and created near the end of the myth, not at the outset. But things get stranger still as we read the account. Let's read it together. Then El said, "Let us make humanity in our image, according to our own likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over all the cattle and all the wild animals on the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So El created humankind in their image. In the image of the gods, he created them. Male and female, he created them. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get started. First, we have multiple uses of plural pronouns in this section, all in reference to the divine beings involved in the creation of humanity. Some point to this passage and claim that this is a reference to the angels of heaven, and the god El is inviting them to witness his creation of humanity. This makes a certain amount of sense, as the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism was influencing the religion of Judah around this period. One of their many contributions to Judaism was the concept of angels, divine servants and messengers who worked for their supreme God, but were themselves not deities. Though even their angels were originally gods, just as the gods of the Hebrew pantheon would later be relegated to the status of angels. Another argument for monotheism in this passage is that El is stating that humanity is made male and female in his image, so that the broad spectrum of humanity represents the presence of God. While this wholesome sentiment is uplifting, the idea that God is represented by all the people and not just a single gender, it's nothing more than modern wishful thinking. The reality is that, at this point in their theology, women were regarded as little more than property of their fathers, who then sold them to their future husbands. And this idea is also endangered by the closing words of the passage, which we will address shortly. As Jewish theology progressed, the gods El Elyon and Yahweh were merged together and imagined to be a singular god, whom was renamed Yahweh El, rendered in English as Lord God. But this story predates the completion of that merger, and certainly the later rejection of other deities, which were still believed to exist and even worshipped by the Jews in and around Jerusalem for centuries to come. And all of that brings us back to the passage in question. El is creating humans in their image, in the image of the Hebrew pantheon, which hasn't yet been whittled down to a singular god. This pantheon includes gods and goddesses, as he states they should create them as male and female in the likeness of the gods of their pantheon. And so they are created as male and female in order to mirror the divine audience. Once this is understood, the passage finally makes sense. Humanity is created male and female to match the male and female gods, and like the gods of any pantheon, they are given dominion over the earth and all that dwells in it. Another point of note in this passage are the words used for the image and likeness. In Hebrew, those words are Salem and Demut. Let's first look at likeness. Demut is also used to mean shadow, which may seem a bit odd to say that humans are created to be the shadows of the gods, but you need to understand their thinking. Many in the ancient world believed that the events on earth represented events which transpired in the heavens. This belief inspired many religious practices among worshippers around the globe as they enacted rituals in hopes of prompting action from the gods that they worshipped. It's also why ancient temples often depicted the constellations on their ceiling. They were constructed to represent the heavens, and the floors represented the earth. When ancient people looked to the stars, they imagined them to be the gods who had representatives on earth, those being kings and princes. And when someone saw a meteor, They believed it was a star falling to the ground, and that meant that the corresponding king or prince would soon die. This is where astrology emerges. It's the belief that these events on Earth can be discerned by examining the movements of celestial bodies. So when the author says that humans are the shadows of their gods, he means exactly that. We are meant to be the earthly counterparts of beings that existed in the heavens. The other word to examine is image, or tselem. This one is a bit more troubling, as it's the exact same word we find when Moses is presented with the commandments and is told to make no images. This is a form of idol, which was used in household worship of various gods, including El and Yahweh, a practice which would eventually become outlawed. But here in Genesis 1, it is El himself who creates an idol, and that idol is humanity, an image of the gods rendered in flesh and set to move about on earth. This is a remnant of those old creation myths, where a craftsman god molds or carves the first humans and either mixes in divine blood or blows in the divine breath to impart spirit into his creation in order to give it life. The word for these idols also means to carve, so humanity consists of carved images meant to serve as a focal point through which one might connect with the deity, which is quite fitting, as that's a point our post-exilic authors will make many times as we cover these books. Their divine kings were dead, and their temple destroyed, so connection to their god became dependent on connection with the community. Once humans exist, El gives them instructions, like the animals before them, to be fruitful and multiply. This is a major contradiction to the story of Eden, in which humans aren't given knowledge of procreation and are punished when they finally discover it for themselves. The animals and humans are also told to eat of the plants of the earth. They won't be given permission to eat meat until after the flood. If you remember your Bible study, then you know that creation is now over, and it's time for El to rest. The 6th day is now complete, and he rests on the 7th, which is where we get the Sabbath. But that isn't quite correct. First, while he may have finished creating all the material, arranging all the matter on earth, he isn't done with temporal creation. Remember, that time was also being arranged as he laid out the cycles of day and night. Second, as we find in the opening of chapter 2, creation still has one more step, the creation of an entire day. And finally, the Sabbath didn't originate with ancient Israel, but came to the residents of Judah from their conquerors in Babylon. Adding days to the calendar was necessary in the ancient world because accurate calendars were tricky to create, and when you base your calendar on the cycle of the moon, as the Jews did in the Second Temple period, your annual calendar is only 355 days, meaning you're off by 10 1/4 days every single year. This necessitates the periodic adding of days in order to bring the calendar back in line with the seasons. Failure to do so results in celebrating summer in the middle of winter and spring months occurring around the autumn harvest. Even ancient solar calendars could be tricky. In 1st Enoch, instructions are given for establishing a working solar calendar. Each season is given 90 days, but an extra day gets added to make the calendar more accurate. And like the Sabbath day added in Genesis 2, these days are set aside for divine beings and form the basis for 4 religious festivals, one in each season. A 5th day would also have been added, presumably to serve as a New Year festival, which would have been devoted to their Most High God in order to give the solar calendar 365 days. So the creation story culminates with the creation of God's image on earth and God's day on the calendar. These aspects of creation are so important, the greatness of this one God above all others, and the importance of only his image rendered in flesh instead of stone or clay, and the creation of his special day set aside for him and his earthly shadows, that they are protected by 3 of the first 4 commandments found in Exodus 20. All of this serves to demythologize the older creation story in which the god of Judah battles Leviathan and Behemoth, two primordial beasts, and enable the formation of the world once these twin destructive forces have been slain. In parallel myths, the bodies of these great ancient enemies, such as Apsu and Tiamat in the Babylonian epic, were used to build the world, just as the firmament is created by dividing the waters on the second day. Tiamat has become the Tehom, the watery deep, and her name, along with that of Behemoth, are echoed in the opening lines, as we are told that the world was formless and void. In the Hebrew, Tohu and Bohu, cognates for Tiamat and Behemoth. These elements, the defeating of the chaos monsters at the beginning of time, were often part of annual festivals, in which the king, who represented their patron god, would reenact the god's struggle with the monsters before being reinvested as ruler of the nation. But in the absence of a king, there was no place for such a festival, and the image of the patron god was now democratized. What we have here is the author engineering a new creation story by refuting the very idea of the classic creation myth. It's Second Temple theology, loudly proclaiming that it lacks elements of a classic mythology found amongst its neighbors, in an attempt to separate itself from its own history, which will become a common theme in the writings of the Hebrew Bible. The purpose of the book is to drive home the point that the people who returned home to Judah are distinct from those who remained in the land after the Babylonians invaded. And the authors go to extreme lengths to bring this point home, from exclaiming that they have no mythology to claiming that their newer religion is actually older than the ancient form of worship that they sought to replace. They would even go so far as to claim that those natives who lived in Judah weren't even Judahites. As they entered the land, sponsored by the Persian court, they would claim that it was the native population who had invaded and had no right to exist in the place where they had lived for centuries. That's going to wrap it up for this episode. You can help the show by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsofgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.